Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the insanity of the narrative around slavery and white guilt and black victimhood. It's deeply embedded in the globalist, guilty and shaming of white people narrative. It's all manufactured and concocted, invented, and so on. But it's very successfully been implanted into the minds of students, probably for the last 30 years, I would think, maybe a bit longer, but around that, all across the Western world. It's particularly in the United States, but all across the Western world. So, and the white-speaking, world is the one that's particularly being singled out for this, but other areas too. Now, the issue is that slavery is uniquely something that only white people ever did. No one else did it. Only white people did it. And these white people, these evil white supremacists, did it only to black people. So this is the narrative. Now, there was a talk panel, a discussion panel on one of the TV stations. So I was channel surfing and noticed one of it, and then some other YouTuber commented on it, but it went sort of something like this. The black people are uniquely victims, uniquely deserving of compensation because of the uniquely evil guilt and wickedness of white people because of slavery. And and it was very narrowly sort of tied around that. Now, one of the guests who was hardly right wing or anything like that, far from it, but they were, I would think, pretty centrist, if not sort of sympathetic to a number of left-wing positions, but they said, hey, slavery's been going on for thousands of years. White people came along to the party quite late and didn't do really that much of it, and only a small number of folks in the United States ever owned slaves anyway. I mean, seriously, why are we sort of sheeting this, that it's a uniquely white guilt and shaming thing? And the rest of the panel erupted. Now, they didn't come forward with any arguments or positions or claims of any substance. They just blurted out and vomited out the talking points and then tried to morally attack the person. I think you're morally bereft. Are you Hitler or something? So they tried that type of approach. But the rest of them almost didn't know what to do. They were thrown into furious confusion and bewilderment. But white supremacy, but Nazi, but swastika, but and they had nothing to say. And then after they'd sort of thought about it, but it was chattel slavery and all the black people died. The ships were packed so tight that they all died. Then how come there's black people in America if they all died? Hitler would only ask that question. And so now I'm going back to when I was in early school. The earliest mention I remember of slavery as a kid, we're talking early primary school here, so it's a while ago, but the earliest mention I remember of slavery was in the Middle East, like the early civilizations, or as it's even referred to today, the cradle of civilization, around the Euphrates River and the Tigris rivers, those major rivers that go through what today is parts of Turkey and Iraq and Syria and around through there. So this is the ancient Assyrians. So we're talking 5,000. We're talking about 7,000 years ago, give or take, a bit more maybe. The Assyrians, Mesopotamians, these ancient civilizations, Parthians, and the list goes on. Ancient Egyptians, but about the Assyrians. So we're talking around 8,000 years ago, give or take, was the first mention that I remember of people having slaves. Now, as a little kid, I didn't understand what it meant. So you just listen to what's told to you. But I remember talking about the slaves and then moving on through history to the slaves in Egypt, and to slaves in in later civilizations around that area in the Middle East, and then going into things like the Ottoman Empire the Middle Ages. Also, the Barbary pirates was covered. There was obviously part of that was the transatlantic slave trade, but it's made very clear that it was black people selling other black people who were already slaves. They're already enslaved to the white merchants and traders along the African west coast. So I remember sort of that. So it was quite a broad brush. There was talk of the Barbary slavers from what today would be like Algiers and around there that would go as far as Iceland, England, Ireland, Iceland, arriving and grabbing anything that they could and going off selling them in the slave markets of North Africa. So that was mentioned. So it was quite a comprehensive coverage of I wouldn't say they concentrated on the history of slavery, but it was mentioned in all these civilizations. And it was also tied back into the biblical thing of Moses, let my people go, and leading the slaves out of Egypt into wherever they went, the Exodus, as I think it was called. So this was the coverage of slavery. So I find it quite amazing that the conversation about slavery and the history of slavery has been completely reframed, again, by the globalist cabal, as being a uniquely white thing. Only white people did it. Now, I've sort of looked around a bit, and there are a number of sort of fallback positions that the advocates for this, that only white people did it, only black people are victims, only black people suffered, only white people benefited, and so on. Now, there's a whole lot of lies going through this, which I'll come back to in a minute, but if they get fully challenged on this, that slavery has been around for thousands of years, the idea of white people being uniquely doing it is beyond absurd. It's quite ridiculous, and it's a lie. So now, if you stick on the point there, then I've noticed that these activists and propagandists, they then do concede that, okay, all right, then white people weren't unique at doing it, but white people commercially benefited from it. That is, they had things like plantations and so on, commercially benefit. So the Arabs tended to use, not the Arabs didn't commercially benefit, but primarily the Arabs tended to use these people as servants or, fetch and carry flunkies, that sort of thing. And so, the guys to do the fan, on the hot day. And so they didn't commercially benefit because they weren't used in what were commercial enterprises back in the time, or at least the evidence to support that is fairly slim. Now, you could do various arguments that slaves were used in parts of the Roman Empire and so on, but again, not necessarily for commercial use, but more like, say, the Greeks had silver mines and they used slaves in the silver mines, things like that. So it was around, but it was patchy. It wasn't directly related to commercial gain. So the idea is, well, white people use slaves for commercial gain. This makes white people thus uniquely evil. So if the white people had used the slaves just to sweep the floor in the house, or I don't know, milk the cows or something like that, that was okay. But if you commercially benefited from it, and again having black workers in a cotton plantation or something like that, sugar plantation, then that was evil. So that's separate. So that's rather a Marxist take on things. So already they switched from white people, only white people did it, evil bad white people. Okay, well, so all right, white people didn't do it. It's been around 1,000 years, but white people were unique because they commercially benefited from the slave. So now you've moved. Once it goes to the second tier here, you're already in a Marxist sort of paradigm of things. Well, they were exploited, and therefore it's oppressor and oppressed paradigm. Now the next thing, following on from the Marxist thing, let's suppose the commercial thing doesn't get a whole lot of traction. Then the next stage they go to is, well, okay, if blacks enslaved other blacks, that's really not a problem. Oh, it's not? Well, why not? Well, they both have equal social power. So because they have equal social power, it's not really slavery, even though they are enslaved, but it's not really slavery because all the blacks have equal social power, so they're enslaving each other, then that's not the same. Now, we see those arguments today in things like if black gangs are shooting each other, like you can in Chicago, you can have 20 plus blacks shooting each other, getting shot on a weekend, and no one really turns a hair or bats an eye. It's like, oh well, that's just black killing each other. That's those damn inner city blacks murdering each other. Who cares? But if a white person shoots a black, then it's international headlines, screaming headlines. White supremacist Nazi with swastika shoots black. Why isn't it just? I mean, isn't murder murder? Isn't someone dying from gunshots just a bad thing universally? Apparently not. If blacks shoot each other, equal social power, who cares? But if a white shoots a black person and the white has more social power, as determined ideologically, then it's a terrible thing, and we all have to froth at the mouth internationally and forever and so on. So the next tier after, so we've got, well, slavery's bad, only white people did it. All right, then everybody's been doing it forever. So let's go. So only white people commercially benefited. But then they come to the third tier that white people doing it was bad because white people had more social power as defined ideologically in today's paradigm, social power. So it was uniquely bad only when white people did it. If a black, the Barbary pirates, the brown or the black people enslaved white people, that's all right because you've got a lower social power enslaving a higher social power. So that's not really slavery. That's kind of, that's really restorative justice kind of thing. So you can see that their argument falls to pieces fairly quickly. Let's come to some of the subset arguments now. Well, firstly, the claim that white people roamed around Africa just rando grabbing black people and enslaving them is beyond absurd. The cost and logistics of doing that would have just been beyond the pale. So blacks were enslaving each other, and always had done, by the way. This is hardly new. And they thought they could make a quick buck by selling, the black princes and warlords and whatever. Thought they could make a quick buck selling their fellow brethren and fellow tribespeople and citizens to the white traders. Now, the white traders didn't particularly want black slaves, by the way. It wasn't like the first go-to. They tried using white people in plantations and they died of diseases. That didn't work. They tried using the local natives because it was much cheaper to do that. I mean, you want a white person working on the plantation because you can give them complex instructions. You can teach them to read and write much more easily if they don't already know it. You've got the same customs, habits, language. They're the same food you eat, and a lot of reasons why you would want to use white people. A whole lot easier, much easier and simpler. But it just didn't work. Then they tried to use the local natives, like the local Indians or the Incas and whatnot in South America. That didn't work either. And on top of that, these people were very susceptible to European diseases, so they were dying from that. But they weren't willing, heavy work, plantation type workers. So they looked around. Well, where else can we get labour from? Remember, this is an issue of labour. It's not an issue of slavery. That's a misreading. It's an issue of labour. So look around and say, well, there's, the population of Africa is huge, and the black princes and whatnot in Africa, they're falling over themselves to enslave their fellow Africans and sell them off. So why don't we get it from there? These black people are very resistant to white folk diseases. They're capable of the heavy, hard work of a plantation. So why don't we get them? Done. So again, it wasn't an issue about slavery. It was purely an issue of labour, and that's forgotten there. The issue of social power is something that has come up today. It certainly wasn't an issue at the time. It was an issue of labour. So the idea is, or the claim is, that they packed the black slaves in, because remember, it's quite a long journey. Back in the days of sail, it's quite a long journey. It could take a couple of months if the weather was ordinary. So the claim is that they packed these slaves in so tight that they had they had barely room to move. They didn't give them food or water. They lived in foul conditions of feces and urine, and they all died before they got to me. What, they all died? Are you kidding me? So the slaver goes, put slaves on the ship, and they all dead by the time the slave arrives. The other, oh, you're right. All these people were very focused on making money. Now, a strong male slave, like 18 or older, capable of heavy work, who had to be fit, absolutely fit to begin work that very second. You could get back in the day, I'm talking about the early late 1700s. You could get $800 for a fully fit slave. $500 for a fully fit woman, $200 for a child in good condition, but that was it. So if the slave was the African slave taken from that was in bad physical condition or dead or clearly ill and covered in sores and carbuncles, you wouldn't get anything. You'd either wouldn't be able to sell them at all, or you'd be lucky if someone would even give you $5. So the idea is you had to get as many people alive at the other end in fully fit condition, not just look, I think he might make it. He looks a bit sick, but I reckon he'll be all right. No. In fully fit, ready to work condition. So they couldn't cram them in tight as was claimed. They just wouldn't be able to sell them at the other end. And for every super fit slave, they get top dollar. So they have to have them well fed, clean, and ready to go in the market. Now, some of the agents that the plantation owners used were very experienced at buying slaves and knew what to look for and how to determine if a slave was in ill health or was unlikely to be able to do the heavy work in a plantation, and they just wouldn't. No. But so the idea that again that they packed them in like sardines and they all died is bullshit. They had to arrive at the other end in tip-top physical condition, otherwise they couldn't sell them. And the only way to make a buck, this is for the guys doing the transporting, the only way to make a buck was to deliver fully fit slaves. Now, if you look at the size of the ships and the number of slaves they could reasonably carry, because remember they've got a crew as well and so on. They had to prepare for a lengthy voyage, possibility of bad weather and so on. So they get to the other end, and they've got maybe a capacity of say 50, maximum capacity of 50, if that. I doubt they'd have that many unless it was an unusually large ship for the day. Then unless they got like 42 of them in tip-top condition. At the other end, they just couldn't make money. They'd be really struggling to make a buck. So that's just the sheer economics of it. Now, when at the other end there were people that had to be paid, like the auctioneers and doctors had to come along and examine the slaves and make sure they had no diseases or they weren't particularly ill. They would often spend a couple of weeks in a holding area being fed. The best quality food and getting lots of rest, and they were encouraged to exercise. So again, that was expensive. So the idea of $800 at the other end, by the time the auctioneer and the doctors and everyone's taken their piece of the action, then the slave the slave ship guys, they'd be lucky to get half of that, maybe slightly more than half of that, and they've had to pay for the upkeep of the ship, crew and all that. So that gives you an idea of the economics of it. And so they had to have, the only way they could succeed at this and make a buck, and they couldn't make a buck, they wouldn't do it, was to have fully fit slaves arriving at the other end. Workers. I mean, slaves is it's workers at the other end. So that was the thing there. Now, slavery in Africa is supposedly was still going on. Today there are places like Libya and so on. It's alleged there's over 1 million slaves there now, and they have slave markets today. So I don't know. Maybe slavery in parts of the world, Pakistan has never ended. Still going on. So the idea that the advanced industrial societies ended slavery, as much because they didn't want the cheap labour competition for the machinery coming in. So it wasn't all totally altruistic or religiously motivated like William Wilberforce and those sort of guys, but nonetheless, it was the white people that ended the slavery. So white people came very late to the slavery game, and not that they hadn't enslaved each other. I mean, again, we need to sort of look at this as workers. In northern England, for example, the tribes, the areas of northern England, years ago, they would go raiding into Scotland to grab labourers, or sometimes if the gene pool was needed a bit of a freshen up, you'd go and grab a few folks from the village down the road or whatever, and use them to procreate in your village. Bear in mind that a little, these small villages, small areas, the world was really not much more than a few miles from their village. So the idea to conceiving this big wide world out there was not easy for some of these people in the ancient times. But on the slavery side of it, the narrative is so corrupted, so dishonest, so full of lies, so full of deceptions that only an aggressive propaganda and funding campaign through education departments and all that sort of thing, only that is what keeps it alive. And I would hope that they start teaching about slavery and saying, hey, slavery's been around for like 10,000 years. Did you know that? And that will open people's eyes. Also undermine a lot of the narrative, or the lies, I should say, the lying narrative of the race grifters and hustlers. You've been tasked to your pushback channel. Thank you for listening.